In a bustling restaurant, voices filled the air with laughter and chatter, but suddenly, a sharp insult pierced the noise. What happened next left everyone in silence, and then in tears. The restaurant was alive with energy. Plates clinked against tabletops, glasses chimed softly, and the aroma of freshly baked bread and sizzling dishes filled the air. Families huddled together at booths, sharing laughs over steaming plates of pasta. At one corner, a couple leaned in close, their conversation drowned by the hum of conversations around them. At the center of it all stood a young waiter, no older than 20, balancing a tray piled with dishes. His uniform, a crisp white shirt and black vest, was slightly wrinkled, a testament to the long shift he'd been working. His movements were quick but careful, his eyes darting between tables, making sure every customer had what they needed. Near the entrance, Barron Trump sat quietly with a small group. His table was tucked away but not hidden, giving him a clear view of the room. He noticed the waiter immediately, not just because of his hurried steps, but because of the nervous energy he carried. It was in the way his shoulders tensed and how he apologized before a customer had even said a word. Everything seemed normal. Just another busy night at the restaurant. But then a voice rose above the noise, sharp, cold, and dripping with disdain. It sliced through the warmth of the room, making heads turn. That's when Barron's attention shifted completely, his gaze locking on the source of the commotion. Something wasn't right. The sharp voice belonged to a man seated at a corner table, dressed in a tailored suit that practically screamed wealth. His gold watch glinted under the warm lights as he waved a hand in the air, calling attention to himself. His tone was loud and dismissive, cutting through the cozy atmosphere of the restaurant like a knife. "You call this service?" he snapped, glaring at the young waiter standing nervously by his table. "I've been sitting here for 10 minutes, and this is the best you can do? This steak is overcooked, the wine isn't chilled, and you expect me to pay for this?" The waiter's face flushed, and he fumbled to apologize. "I'm so sorry, sir," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the man's tirade. "I can have the chef remake it right away." "Or," the man interrupted, scoffing loudly, "don't bother. You're clearly not qualified to do your job. Maybe they should hire someone who knows what they're doing." Barron watched the scene unfold from his table, his chest tightening as he saw the waiter's shoulders slump. The young man's hands trembled as he clutched his notepad, his eyes fixed on the floor like he wished he could disappear. Around them, other diners exchanged awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable, but no one stepped in. The restaurant that had been buzzing with life only moments ago now felt heavy with silence. Barron clenched his jaw, his gaze shifting between the waiter and the man in the suit. It wasn't just the words that stung. It was the way the man delivered them, with such casual cruelty, as if the waiter's dignity meant nothing. He thought about how many times people like that man used their power to belittle others, just because they could. The silence from the other diners only made it worse, as if their discomfort meant they'd rather look away than stand up for what was right. The waiter tried to speak again, his voice cracking. I'll see what I can do to fix this, sir," the man sneered. "Don't bother, just stay out of my sight." Barron couldn't take it anymore. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood up, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. All eyes turned to him as he took a deep breath, his voice steady and clear. "Excuse me," he said, his gaze fixed on the man in the suit, "but I think you owe him an apology." The restaurant fell into an uneasy silence. All eyes were now on Barron, who stood tall, his expression calm but firm. The man in the suit turned his head slowly, his disbelief evident in the smirk that spread across his face. "Excuse me?" the man said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Who do you think you are, kid?" Barron held his ground, his voice steady. "I'm someone who doesn't think it's okay to humiliate people just because you're unhappy with your meal. You could have handled this with respect." The man chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Respect? For what? This is what I'm paying for." "Huh? Service. If he can't handle the job, that's not my problem." Barron could feel the tension in the room thickening, the weight of dozens of eyes watching him. He glanced at the waiter, who stood frozen, his face pale, as if he couldn't believe someone had come to his defense. "This isn't about your steak or your wine," Barron said, his tone unwavering. "It's about the way you treat people. He's working hard, trying his best, and all you've done is tear him down. You think that makes you better? It doesn't. For a moment, the man didn't respond. He looked Barron up and down, clearly trying to gauge who he was dealing with. Then, with a dismissive wave, he said, "This isn't your business, kid. Sit down." But Barron didn't move. "You're right. It's not my business. But staying silent when someone is being mistreated? That doesn't sit right with me." The man's smirk faltered for a moment, and Barron noticed it. He pressed on, speaking not just to the man but to everyone in the room. "We all see what's happening here, and we've all been in his shoes, trying our hardest, only to be judged by someone who doesn't know us. Think about that. How would you feel if someone treated you the way you just treated him?" A woman seated nearby, who had been quietly watching, suddenly spoke up. "He's right," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "There's no reason to talk to someone like that. It's cruel." Others in the room nodded, murmuring their agreement. Barron could feel the shift in the atmosphere. People who had been too uncomfortable to say anything were now finding their voices. The man in the suit looked around, realizing the room was no longer on his side. He scowled, his bravado slipping. "Fine," he muttered, his tone defensive. "If everyone here is so concerned about the waiter's feelings, then maybe he should do his job properly next time." The waiter looked and walked around the table, slicing more meat and pushing it aside. Barron shook his head. "An apology doesn't cost you anything, but it can mean everything to the person you've hurt. If you can't see that, maybe you should think about why." The waiter looked stunned, his hand still trembling as he nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Thank you." But Barron wasn't finished. He took a step closer, his tone softening as he addressed the waiter directly. "You're doing a great job," he said. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not. Some people forget what it's like to work hard, but that doesn't mean their words define you." The waiter's eyes filled with tears, but he managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. As Barron sat back down at his table, the restaurant erupted into quiet applause. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was enough to show that people had been moved. The tension in the room began to lift, replaced by a sense of solidarity and admiration. Barron glanced at the waiter one more time, nodding reassuringly. The young man straightened his posture, his confidence visibly returning. The man in the suit, on the other hand, sat silently, avoiding eye contact with anyone as he finished his meal. Barron didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered, and the shift in the room was proof that sometimes standing up for what's right can change everything. As the soft applause faded, the tension in the restaurant seemed to dissolve. Barron returned to his seat, quietly sipping his drink, his focus shifting back to his table. But the waiter, still visibly shaken, lingered near the kitchen, nervously glancing back toward Barron's table. It was clear that something had shifted within him, something he hadn't expected. Moments later, the waiter gathered his courage and approached Barron's table, his steps hesitant but deliberate. His hands clutched a small notepad, but his focus wasn't on taking an order. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice wavering but full of gratitude. I just wanted to say thank you." Barron looked up, offering the young man a kind smile. "No need to thank me," he said. "You didn't deserve what happened back there." The waiter nodded, swallowing hard. "It's just, I've been working here for months, and people like him," he gestured faintly toward the man in the suit, who was now avoiding everyone's gaze. "They come in all the time. They treat me like I'm invisible, like I don't matter. I try to brush it off, but it gets hard, you know?" Barron's expression softened. "I know," he said quietly, "but you do matter. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't." The young man smiled, his eyes glistening. He opened his mouth to say something more, but was interrupted by the sound of someone clearing their throat nearby. Everyone turned to see the elderly man who had been seated by the window standing up, leaning heavily on his cane. He walked slowly toward the waiter, his face lined with years of wisdom and a quiet strength. "Young man," he said, addressing the waiter, "what that boy did today, that's something we should all learn from. But I want to say this to you. I see you. I see the work you're putting in, and I want you to know it doesn't go unnoticed." The waiter's eyes filled with tears as the old man reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, placing it in the waiter's hand. "Take this," he said, his voice steady. "Not because I pity you, but because I respect you. Use it for something that brings you joy. You've earned it." The waiter's hand trembled as he held the bill, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. Thank you so much." What happened next was completely unexpected. One by one, other diners began to stand, each walking over to the waiter with small bills in hand. A woman pressed a $20 bill into his palm. A man from another table handed him a $50. The family, with 2 children, added what cash they had, along with a few kind words. The waiter stood frozen, overwhelmed by the outpouring of kindness. Tears streamed down his face as he tried to thank everyone, but the words caught in his throat. Barron watched quietly, a small smile tugging at his lips. He hadn't expected this. He'd only wanted to do the right thing, but seeing the ripple effect of one small act of courage was more powerful than he could have imagined. By the time it was over, the waiter held a handful of bills. But it wasn't the money that moved him. It was the validation, the proof that he wasn't invisible. The other diners returned to their seats, their conversations lighter, their moods brighter. The man in the suit, now thoroughly embarrassed, muttered something under his breath and left the restaurant in a huff, leaving behind an untouched plate. The waiter turned back to Barron, his voice steady despite his tears. "You didn't just stand up for me," he said. "You reminded me that there's good in this world. And I'll never forget it." Barron nodded, his heart full. "You'll do the same for someone else someday. That's how it works." And in that moment, the restaurant wasn't just a place for meals. It became a space for humanity to shine. As the waiter stood clutching the handful of bills, his eyes moved slowly across the room, meeting the faces of those who had offered their kindness. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His lips trembled as he finally managed to say, "Thank you. All of you. I don't even know what to say." "Yes," a woman seated nearby smiled warmly. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that you're appreciated." The elderly man who had first stepped up nodded, his eyes shining with a quiet pride. "It's not about the money, son. It's about knowing that people see you, respect you, and value what you do. Don't ever forget that." The once tense restaurant now felt warm and united, as if the shared act of kindness had melted away the earlier discomfort. Conversations resumed, but they carried a lighter tone, filled with laughter and soft smiles. The waiter turned back to Barron, his voice steadier now but still thick with emotion. "You started all this," he said, his gratitude spilling over. "I'll never forget it. You didn't just help me. You reminded everyone here what kindness looks like." Barron smiled faintly, his voice calm but firm. "You deserve it, and you'll do the same for someone else when the time comes."